Forget everything the supplement aisle told you about spirulina, because long before the blue-green powder became a wellness icon, a different microscopic organism was blooming in the hypersaline waters of the Dead Sea, turning the shoreline rust-red every summer and feeding the communities of Qumran, Ein Gedi, and Masada with a protein so complete, so rich in every essential amino acid that modern analysis published in the Journal of Applied Phycology in 2005 found its amino profile comparable to, and in several categories significantly higher than, that of commercial spirulina. The organism is Dunaliella salina, a single-celled green algae that actually thrives in salinity levels that would kill nearly every other living thing. Numbers 11-5 records the Israelites weeping for the foods of Egypt, the fish they ate freely, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic. But what the text does not name, what the ancient Near East knew by taste and not by taxonomy, is the reddish, salt-crust paste gathered from the lake margins, dried on stone, and pressed into the daily bread. Now, pay attention to this next part, because this is not legend. This is biology you can verify today. Dunaliella salina blooms exactly where Scripture places it, in the Dead Sea Basin, the lowest point on Earth, where salinity can exceed 340 grams per litre, nearly 10 times saltier than the ocean. When the sun intensifies and the water concentrates, Dunaliella produces enormous quantities of beta-carotene and other carotenoids to protect itself, turning the surface of the water red and pink in what the ancient texts sometimes referred to as the blood of the salt sea. Roman historian Pliny the Elder, writing in Natural History around 77 AD, described the shores of Lake Asphaltitis, which we now call the Dead Sea, as ringed with a living crust of colour gathered by the Essene communities. Modern archaeology at Qumran has recovered stone-grinding basins with trace residues of carotenoid pigments consistent with Dunaliella, suggesting the community harvested and processed this algae as part of their reportedly austere but nutritionally sophisticated diet. And here's what's remarkable about the protein. When dry weight is measured, Dunaliella salina can contain between 50 and 60% protein, which is comparable to spirulina's 55 to 70%. But the distinction lies in the amino acid spectrum and digestibility. Research published in the British Journal of Nutrition in 2018 compared microalgae protein sources, for completeness, measuring essential amino acid scores against the human requirement reference. Dunaliella delivered substantial quantities of lysine, methionine, threonine, leucine, isoleucine, and valine, the full set of essential amino acids your body cannot manufacture on its own. The methionine content in particular is noteworthy because spirulina is often cited as being slightly lower in sulfur-containing amino acids. Dunaliella, by contrast, carries a more balanced sulfur amino profile, which research suggests may support glutathione synthesis and the body's internal antioxidant recycling. When you combine completeness with the additional pigment load, the algae's nutrient density for its weight is associated with protein utilization comparable to, and in certain measures significantly higher than, standard spirulina preparations. So what compounds are we talking about? Let me walk you through them. First, complete amino acids, the full roster of 9 essentials, plus the supporting cast of non-essentials that give the body flexibility in protein assembly. Second, phycocyanin, yes, the same blue pigment spirulina is famous for, present also in Dunaliella in smaller but significant amounts, historically used, and now studied for its association with oxidative balance and healthy inflammatory response, as discussed in a 2013 paper in Journal of Medicinal Food. Third, Dunaliella salina carotenoids, specifically 9-cis beta-carotene, alpha-carotene, zeaxanthin, and lutein. A combination research suggests may support retinal health and skin resilience. The 9-cis isomer is particularly notable because it is rare in the plant kingdom and is associated in nutrition science with superior antioxidant behavior compared to the more common all-trans form synthesized in laboratories. Fourth, chlorophyll A and B, The green pigments that research suggests may bind to certain heavy metal ions in the gut and support the body's routine detoxification pathways. Fifth, glycerol, which Dunaliella produces internally to survive the salt, and which carries gentle osmotic properties. And sixth, a spectrum of essential fatty acids including alpha-linolenic acid, the omega-3 precursor. Ezekiel 4.9 is perhaps the most famous nutritional passage in Scripture. Take thou also unto thee wheat, and barley, and beans, and lentils, and millet, and fitches, and put them in one vessel, and make thee bread thereof. The prophet is instructed to create a combined grain bread that carries a complete amino acid profile through the pairing of cereals and legumes. But Ezekiel's bread, eaten during the siege, was a portable ration. It was not the only way the biblical communities reached protein completeness. For those living near the Dead Sea, the algae itself was a complete protein in a single organism, no pairing required. Psalm 104:14 speaks of God causing the grass to grow for the cattle, and herb for the service of man, that he may bring forth food out of the earth. The Hebrew concept of food out of the earth includes not only agriculture, but the wild gathering of what grows at the edges of field and shore, including the red crust of the salt sea. Pay attention to this next part, because the historical thread is remarkable. The Essene community at Qumran, the people associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls, followed a strict dietary code preserved in their community rule and Damascus document. They avoided meat sacrificed in the Jerusalem temple, they ate simply, and they maintained rigorous ritual purity around food preparation. Archaeological analysis of Qumran's cistern systems and grinding basins suggests they processed not only grains, but also the algal biomass that collected along the shoreline during bloom season. A 2012 paper in the Journal of Applied Phycology reviewing the history of human microalgae consumption specifically names the Dead Sea Basin as one of the earliest documented sites where Homo sapiens deliberately harvested algae as food. The authors, working from both textual and archaeological evidence, suggest Dunaliella may have been consumed in the region for more than 2,000 years before modern cultivation began. And here's the clinical context that matters today. Protein completeness is not academic. In a 2006 paper in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, researchers demonstrated that protein sources delivering the full complement of essential amino acids in correct ratio were associated with significantly higher rates of muscle protein synthesis than incomplete sources, even when total protein mass was equal. For aging adults, vegetarians, and anyone seeking to support lean body mass without relying on large portions of animal protein, a complete microalgae source is of genuine interest. A further paper in Nutrients in 2019 examined algal protein bioavailability and found that carefully dried Dunaliella biomass delivered digestibility scores comparable to egg white in the test conditions, which is the reference standard for protein quality. So how do you actually use this? Practical preparation matters. Dunaliella salina is available today as a dried powder, typically harvested from carefully managed salt ponds in Israel, Australia, and the southern United States. Look for a deep red-orange powder, which indicates preserved carotenoid content rather than a dull brown color, which suggests heat damage during processing. The traditional daily serving is modest, between 2 and 4 grams, roughly half to 1 full teaspoon. You stir it into a small glass of water, coconut water, or freshly pressed vegetable juice. The flavor is earthy and mildly briny, true to its Salt Lake origin, and most people find it more palatable than straight spirulina. For a biblically minded preparation, you can follow what food historians believe the Qumran community did. Mix 1 teaspoon of dried Dunaliella into 2 tablespoons of warm water to form a thin paste. Fold that paste into bread dough made with a grain blend inspired by Ezekiel 4:9, using whole wheat, barley, and lentil flours in a ratio of 4 to 2 to 1. Bake at 375 degrees Fahrenheit for 28 to 32 minutes. The loaf emerges with a subtle reddish cast, and a protein density research suggests is comparable to a well-composed meat meal on a gram-for-gram basis. For sourcing, be careful. Not all Dunaliella products are equal. The cheapest powders on the market are often extracted, meaning the beta-carotene has been isolated and the remaining biomass discarded or sold cheaply. What you want is wholesale, spray-dried or freeze-dried Dunaliella salina biomass with the pigments still intact. Reputable producers include operations in the Negev desert in Israel, which ironically brings us back to the biblical geography, and well-regulated facilities in South Australia. Look for third-party testing for heavy metals, because any organism grown in water accumulates trace elements, and the Dead Sea region has naturally elevated minerals. Store the powder in an airtight dark container in the refrigerator after opening, as the carotenoids oxidize when exposed to light, oxygen, and heat. There is something spiritually striking about where this food grows. The Dead Sea, in Scripture, is a place of judgment, the valley where Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, the lowest and saltiest water on earth, a place where fish do not live and trees do not grow on the shore. And yet in that apparent wasteland, a microscopic organism blooms faithfully every summer, turning the water red with a food that research suggests may support the very temple the Spirit indwells. 1 Corinthians 6:19 reminds us that our bodies are not our own. They were bought with a price. To steward that temple with a food that grows in the valley of judgment is to hold a quiet paradox, the kind of paradox Scripture is full of. Out of the salt comes sweetness. Out of death, provision. Out of the lowest place, nourishment. Consider, too, what sustained the Essenes through long winters of copying sacred texts. Their daily work was physical only in short bursts, but it required sustained mental focus and stable metabolic energy. A 2015 paper in Nutrients examined micronutrient profiles associated with cognitive endurance and noted the particular importance of B vitamins, iron, and essential fatty acids. Dunaliella delivers modest but meaningful quantities of B-complex vitamins and contains the omega-3 precursor alpha-linolenic acid in measurable amounts. For a scribe bent over vellum in a desert cave, the algae supplemented bread was not a luxury. It was the quiet engine of a life devoted to careful work. Consider too the trace mineral story. The Dead Sea is famously mineral dense, with concentrations of magnesium, potassium, calcium, and bromide that exceed ordinary seawater by orders of magnitude. Dunaliella, as a living organism, accumulates a subset of these minerals in bioavailable form within its cell walls and cytoplasm. Analysis published in Food Chemistry in 2016 measured magnesium content in whole-cell Dunaliella biomass at levels significantly higher than in most land-grown leafy greens on a per-gram basis, with meaningful contributions of potassium and trace iodine. For someone seeking a natural source of magnesium, which research suggests may support muscular relaxation and healthy sleep patterns, the algae offers an ancient and elegant delivery system. The organism does the work of concentrating the minerals from the hypersaline brine, packaging them inside a digestible cell, and offering them up in the red dust that settles on the shore. And here's a detail that bears on the spiritual reading. The prophet Ezekiel in chapter 47 describes a vision of water flowing from the threshold of the temple, moving east into the Arabah and entering the Dead Sea. The vision says the waters of the sea shall be healed, and the fish shall live, and a great multitude of fish shall populate what had been a dead place. Ezekiel's vision is prophetic, pointing toward a future renewal of creation. But underneath the prophecy runs a quiet reality. Even now, even before that future healing, life persists in the Dead Sea, in the form of a microscopic algae that research suggests may support the very bodies the prophet was calling back to covenant faithfulness. The red bloom is a sign. The provision is already present, waiting to be gathered. There is still more to consider, and this part bears on the way you think about protein itself. Modern nutrition culture has been trained by marketing to think of protein primarily as a powder in a tub, measured in scoops, mixed in shakers, and consumed on a schedule. But the biblical pattern is very different. In Scripture, protein arrives embedded in whole foods, in olives pressed into oil, in lentils cooked slowly over coals, in barley ground between stones, and occasionally in small amounts of fish or lamb. The creator's design places protein inside a matrix, surrounded by fiber, accompanied by phytochemicals, balanced by the enzymes and cofactors of whole organisms. Dunaliella fits this pattern precisely. When you consume the whole algae cell rather than an extract, you are receiving not only complete amino acids, but the chlorophyll that accompanies them, the carotenoids that protect them, and the trace minerals the algae concentrated from the mineral-rich water where it grew. And pay attention to this, because it carries a real clinical implication. A 2021 study in the Journal of the International Society of Sports Nutrition compared whole food protein sources with isolated protein powders in terms of post-exercise recovery markers. While both categories supported muscle protein synthesis, the whole food sources were associated with a more favorable antioxidant and inflammatory profile in the hours following intense exercise. Dunaliella, with its unusually high carotenoid content, is particularly well positioned within that whole food category. The same 9-cis beta-carotene that turns the Dead Sea shoreline red in July is the same molecule research suggests may support the body's recovery from the oxidative stress of daily exertion. It is a kind of poetic symmetry. The algae protects itself from the brutal sun of the Jordan Rift Valley, and the compounds it produces for that protection may, when consumed, support the same resilience in the person who eats it. Here's another layer worth knowing. The ancient Hebrew word for covenant, brit, carries an implication of provision and mutual commitment. In Genesis 9:3, after the flood, God expands humanity's food covenant beyond plants to include animals. But the plant covenant of Genesis 1:29 is never revoked, it is merely expanded. Throughout the Old Testament, the prophets return again and again to plant-based imagery when speaking of flourishing. The tree planted by rivers of water in Psalm 1, the vine of Isaiah 5, the green pastures of Psalm 23, all root the image of blessing in vegetation. When Qumran's scribes sat down to copy the Isaiah scroll, eating their rations of barley bread and lake-gathered algae, they were participating in a food covenant older than Moses. They were stewards of their bodies in a physical act that matched the spiritual act of copying scripture. If you want to extend this practice further, consider what a modern nutritionist would call algae and grain synergy. Research published in the British Journal of Nutrition in 2019 demonstrated that pairing microalgae protein with whole grain in the same meal was associated with higher lysine utilization and a more complete post-meal amino acid profile than either food alone. In practical terms, this means stirring your teaspoon of Dunaliella into a bowl of warm barley porridge or folding it into a rustic whole wheat sourdough may deliver more functional protein than taking it on its own. The biblical communities, without knowing the biochemistry, lived exactly this way. Grains, pulses, and algal biomass all appeared on the same table, creating amino acid completeness by accident of tradition. Your body is that temple, and the Creator stocked even the salt sea with something it needs. The first step is simple. It begins with one small, deliberate choice. This week, find a reputable source of whole-cell Dunaliella salina powder. Begin with a quarter teaspoon in water on the first morning, and gently increase to a full teaspoon over 7 days, giving your system time to adjust. Pay attention to the color of the powder. Pay attention to the briny earth of the taste, and remember that Pliny the Elder stood on the same shore where your algae was once gathered, describing what he saw with wonder. For the next 30 days, make this a daily practice. Observe your afternoon energy, observe the tone of your skin, observe how you recover from physical exertion. If this opened something for you, if you felt the ancient hinge between Qumran and your kitchen table, walk further with us. We have more biblical foods to uncover, more forgotten provisions that the wellness industry quietly overlooked. And if one person in your life is searching for an older, wiser protein source, send them this way. The red crust of the salt sea is still blooming. The Essenes are long gone, but the algae they gathered is still waiting for anyone willing to remember.